we're always talking at 6,000 miles an hour, right?
Right.
And that's documented. You've read it, I've read it. When you go to look up a bunch of stuff on it, they put it in kilometers, they do whatever, and it's a whole lot slower. I'm going to share the screen here, and I'll show you what we've been calculating.
So don't forget it, but it doesn't matter what we calculate. It's what's in their journals. It's what's in the PD. It's what they say.
That's right. But the initial one said that the orbital mechanics stated that when they were going to the moon, they slowed down to the L zone and then sped up to 6,000 miles an hour for orbital entry to enter at 60 miles.
Yep, that's right.
6,000 miles an hour at 60 miles.
Don't forget now you're looking at something different here. That's to meet the command module. And now the command module is orbiting at 6,000 miles an hour. It has to be because this thing has to catch it.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, and then it says source. This information is taken directly from the Apollo 11 flight journal.
Oh, that's a laugh. Sorry.
That's a laugh, all right.
I'll just show you here. So when you go to the diameter of the moon, we'll stay in miles an hour. It's right here.
Yeah, 2160. Call it that.
Well, I'll just put in right in the calculator here. It's 5.9. Skip the 0.2 on it. They're traveling 60 miles off the surface. So we need to add 120 miles to that.
Okay.
And then multiply it by 3.14. There's how far it is to go around in the orbit when you're 60 miles off the surface. To do that in 1 hour, you are traveling at that speed.
Yep, that's right.
7156 to do that in 1 hour. Then when you pull this up, it says they're traveling at 5,000 miles an hour. So now you pull up, and I asked how many times Apollo 11 spacecraft, the CSM, orbited the moon while they were staying there. It says 31 times in 2.5 days. That works out to 3,600 miles an hour that they were traveling. Then it says 5,000 miles an hour is their entry speed. They entered the moon's orbit traveling at 5,000 miles an hour. There's the distance, and it's 5,000 miles an hour. Then I asked how fast the ascent module had to be traveling to meet up with it. So it also says 5,000 miles an hour. If they went 31 times, if they're traveling around the moon at 7156 to travel around in the orbit, and they multiplied by 31 times, that's the total distance that they're traveling at that, and you divide that by 60, that's the speed that they were traveling at, not 5,000 miles an hour.
That works. That 3,600 works.
But it doesn't. They're traveling 5,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, well, that's according to NASA's Lunar Surface Journal.
Right, but this is also how many times they orbited in 2.5 days. And to only do 31 times around the moon in 2.5 days, that's the speed that they were traveling at, not 5,000. You see the problem?
Yep. They don't know what they're talking about.
Right. So is it
Yeah.
5,000 miles an hour? Is it the original documents that said it was 60 miles at 6,000 miles an hour? Because to do it in 1 hour, you have to be traveling 7,156 miles an hour. So if they say they orbited every hour, they have to be traveling that fast. But if they only orbited 31 times in 2.5 days, then they're only traveling this speed. That's the entire problem. It's all minutia. But you see, all of the calculations, it doesn't matter how you do this, it is going to be different all the time.
I asked ChatGPT-4, Apollo orbited the moon at 6,000 miles per hour each hour, and it says, not exactly. The Apollo Command and Service Module orbited the moon at approximately 3,760 miles per hour, not 6,000.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Then I go to Google and I ask Google the same question, and it says 2,757 miles per hour, one orbit of the moon. So who's right? What's going on here? Can't AI do mathematics?
No, can't get it right. It's probably working in centimeters instead of miles, or nautical miles instead of imperial miles.
Inchworms.
Inchworms?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
They travel a little bit differently all the time, right? As they climb over shit. It just gets different.
Starting like you did with the diameter of the moon at 2160 miles.
Yeah.
Multiply that by pi, which is the diameter.
You have to add the orbit, how far they're off the surface.
Yeah, of
So
course.
60 miles, it's 120. The diameter is now 120 miles more than that.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, that's what we did in the calculations.
Yeah, I know. It's exactly what we did in the calculation.
And now you have, when you multiply it by 3.14, it is 7,156 miles around.
How long did the spacecraft take to orbit the moon?
2 hours.
Well, if it's 2 hours, then it would be traveling at about 3,600 miles an hour. So now we have to calculate the time it took to orbit the moon. Now, there's one way of doing that. When the spacecraft is orbiting the moon, it spends some time out of radio communication with Earth because it's being hidden by the moon. So how long was that time that it was out of communication? The figure normally given is about 40 minutes during its orbit. Now, if that is correct, then the orbit of the moon would be, as you said, best part of 2 hours, because the time it's out of communication, hidden by the moon, is, say, 40 minutes. If that's 60% of the diameter of the moon, but it would be more than 1 hour, a great deal more than 1 hour, depending on its speed.
If you look at the stuff when they could communicate line of sight for the people on the lunar surface, they had 22 minutes out of every hour that they were in line of sight. And now all of this stuff is completely different.
Yeah, it is.
Because they're going a hell of a lot slower. That was based on a 1 hour rotation around. And then you read the other one and it says it's orbiting at 5,000 miles an hour. The ascent module had to reach 5,000 miles an hour. But if the thing's only traveling 3,600 miles an hour, they don't need to be traveling 5,000 miles an hour.
That's true.
And now we go back to the rockets themselves. Their speed of acceleration off the surface, when you look at the mechanics of that, burned what, 7 minutes and 40 seconds, something like that? The burn time of the ascent going up. And when you read those documents, they had to reach 6,000 miles an hour.
So if they can't now, 55 years after Apollo 11 allegedly landed, work out what speed the command module is doing around the moon, let alone the speed at which the ascent stage has to accelerate to reach the command module, it's no wonder they can't get back to the moon.
Well, now it takes 6 days to get there. What's going on?
Well, it takes 3 days to get there if you just get escape velocity, 25,000 miles an hour, switch everything off and just coast to the moon. That's 3 days. So why are they taking 2 weeks now doing this ridiculous orbit that they're trying to do? And they landed, was it the Blue Ghost craft? They managed to land that on the moon. Terribly proud about that.
What's Blue Ghost there for? More radiation readings?
Probably more radiation reading, just see if they can get there. They got 2 more craft coming up to land on the moon in the next few weeks. No, it's going to get crowded around lunar orbit, isn't it?
Yeah, one fella at the shop, he said to me, he says, well, what happens if that Blue Ghost takes pictures of the lunar lander and everything that Apollo left there? And I says, they're not going to be able to because 1, there's nothing there to see, and 2, they're not allowed anywhere near that landing site, even flying over it at 10 miles. They can't go anywhere near that landing site because it's heritage. So how are you going to prove anything? And by the way, Blue Ghost would have a beautiful color camera in it too. And the more pixels that camera is able to decipher, the clearer the image is going to be, which means that they're going to get a clearer picture of some spent rocket stage that's been laying on the moon for the last 50, 60 years. That's all they're going to get. They're not going to get anything.
Not going to get anything at all. You know, it's ridiculous.
10 scientific payloads on board, landed near an ancient volcano. Then on the Merry Christmas, where it landed on the moon.
I mean, at least they got something there, but they weren't humans. They were unmanned craft, these things. That can easily be protected.
Musk is pissed off because he's got a Blue Ghost and the UK's got a Silver Ghost. Anyway, that's where it landed on the moon.
You know, it's about time they are starting to get there and do something for real as far as I'm concerned.
Interesting chat with Wheezy and co on Saturday.
I got about 2 minutes of Randy when it was kind of clear. There was one question that I got that Randy, when it was actually clear about the rockets and the fuel, because even the everyday astronaut, you watch that video, right? You listen to him, and he's talking just like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Look at the size of the rocket. Look at how much fuel. Where do you think we're going? Right? Well, guess what? 2 minutes and 42 seconds later, all of that's gone. First stage is gone. Your big fancy rocket engines are gone. It takes a second stage and a bit of the third stage to get to orbit. Now what have you got left? Partial tanks on the CSM. Then they do a lunar injection, burning up most of that fuel in the CSM. They still have to adjust in their orbit, which is either 3,600 miles an hour, 5,000, 6,000, or 7,000 miles an hour, depending on how long it takes them to get around the moon, now that we've done all those calculations. And then they don't need to use any fuel because Woody Woodpecker said, well, it's downhill all the way. But yes, they needed to use whatever fuel was left there to escape the lunar gravity to get back. But was there enough fuel there? I doubt it. It certainly wasn't in the lander. I mean, look at the size of the images they do for landers today with the giant fuel tanks to land.
They do.
And those tanks, even at the best, if each tank is a cubic meter, that would be pushing it. When you look at all the diagrams, because the entire quadrant is only 1.5 meters. Now you're putting a round tank in there and you've got 12 inches of micrometeor shielding around it. So you have a tube that is 48 inches high by about 36 inches in diameter. That's your tank. And that's going to get you down. And when you look at the other ones, they're 9 and 10 feet tall and 8 feet across. And there's 8 of them, not 4. I mean, quite the difference. But, you know, like back then, the gravity wasn't so severe so they could land better, right? Wasn't a problem. Didn't even put a dent in the surface. The gravity's so light that the legs didn't compress. Of course, Earth's atmosphere extended out past the moon for them so that, you know, they could have a cigarette. You know?
That's another thing people don't really understand, especially when it comes to human anatomy. And when you get hooked on tobacco, like those guys were, you're not going to be going one day without a cigarette. And as we've shown, the sand pit that they're using, they turned into an ashtray in that clean room.
They did.
Now, how are they going to go? And I checked. They had no nicotine substitutes on the way. The medical staff didn't bring them down or tell them to slowly cut down so that you could handle this. They were just cut right off like that.
Yeah, because they all had the right stuff, don't forget.
But that right stuff comes out the backside as well. By the way, there's brand new videos out on the moon hoax again. Just like we watched the other one, there's 3 or 4 more come out. And they're just repeats because they've got you and Trevor in it. The same one been repeated and brought up again and again.
Yeah, but look at how many views they're getting. I mean, some of these are getting 120,000 views in 3 days. How come?
Because it's part of the whole algorithm of putting it out to people who may be questioning it.
We put it on there, and look what happens. Nobody will watch it because it doesn't get put out. But how come they can put it out and they get 120,000 views in a few days? And yes, it is clear. I have the original here, by the way. Yeah. That is a very clear copy that they have that these guys are putting out there, too.
Just one thing on Apollo 13, assuming that they actually got to the moon, but they couldn't use any engine other than the Lunar Lander descent stage engine. That's the only engine they had available to them, because the lunar lander, the combined lunar lander, was attached to the command module. And the lunar lander descent stage engine was the only one they had available to maneuver the craft, we're told. Now, if you do the delta V calculation for getting that craft, assuming it went round the back of the moon, what's the delta V for the engine on the descent stage to maneuver and accelerate all those lander, command module, and service module, which are all combined together at that point? What's the delta V to get that assembly back to Earth?
That would be because you're looking at the lunar lander, which is 60,000 pounds when it's loaded with fuel.
Yeah, okay.
Pounds on there, 30 ton. And when they land, they lose 10 ton of fuel to land, is in the document. So there's still 50 there. The total weight of their thing when it's fully loaded with fuel when they take off for the lunar injection is 141 tons. That's
So
the payload.
That's quite a lot.
The payload was 141 tons. The only thing left you would have to take off of that was the fuel that they used for that little final orbit that they had to get into around the Earth, and then what they used for the lunar injection. You're still going to be 80 ton.
But could the descent stage engine, fuel available for that engine only, you weren't able to transfer fuel from the ascent stage to the descent stage, let alone from the command module or the service module. You couldn't transfer fuel. So I think the calculation will show quite clearly that that maneuver round the back of the moon was impossible to achieve, let alone come back to Earth.
It didn't have the thrust capabilities.
Exactly.
It's only 10,500 pounds of thrust. It throttled down to 20%. And remember, I did the calculation years ago, and they had 30 seconds of fuel left hovering when Neil landed. But at full throttle, it's using 10 times the amount. So that's only 3 seconds at full throttle.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they added the rover and a whole bunch of more batteries because Alan Bean said we used a lot more batteries. Before you got on, I caught a little bit of Jarrett talking to Randy about the extra weight of the vehicle and did they add more fuel to it? No, they didn't, because the tanks were already maximized for the quadrants. They couldn't make them bigger, so there was no more fuel. But when you're looking at batteries that are 60 kilos apiece, and it takes 3 of them for a 1-day stay, for a 3-day stay, they got to add 6 more. Then add the rover to that, which is what, almost 500 pounds. And I don't know if that includes the battery, because those batteries were 75 kilos. I don't think the batteries are included in the weight of that rover. So you got to have those batteries. And then they went from 2.5 hours EVA to 24 hours of EVA. So it's 10 times the consumables right there. All of that has to be on there. And then they don't have an airlock, so every time they have to have oxygen and air to regenerate that when they close the door. Those tanks have to be bigger to open and shut the door every time.
That was 3 times they did walks on Apollo 17.
Yeah, 15, 16, and 17. They're repressurizing. All of that stuff is all consumables, and it has to be added to that weight.
Yeah, plus the diapers. Don't forget the diapers.
And the diapers. And the CO2 scrubbers, where the hell are all of those? Because those were changed every 10 hours.
But surely they would be shown in the diagrams of the command module and the lunar module. You'd see storage for scrubbers or storage for diapers. But you don't
there is for the diapers, and it's a little wee rack about this big.
Well, that's not going to be very good, is it?
You know, it's a drawer you can put a half a dozen of them in. And there's one extra things for the CO2 scrubbers, an extra container for those. You need 100 of them. And then the ones for the PLS packs as well. Because they got scrubbers in them that have to be changed and batteries that have to be changed. Water and oxygen has to be put back in those. And none of that is available because they just don't have any space to put it. I mean, they already got rid of the helium tanks just to put the rover in there.
Well, that's going to cause a bit of a problem, because helium is used to pressurize the tanks to drive the fuel out.
Exactly. It's controlling them. The fuel's going to come out because they're in a vacuum, but it's not going to come out under a controlled amount, or maybe it needs to be more pressurized than that to come out to get a proper burn. But then Randy was saying, if you have all of that on, you already got this 141 tons when you started on Apollo 11. If you're going to add 2 or 3 metric tons, probably 4 metric tons by the time you put the rover and to be able to stay 3 days. You're going to have at least 4 metric ton more. Well, you have to add that to the fuel of the Saturn V rocket because that's 1,000 to 1. You need 1,000 pounds of fuel for the F1 rockets to lift 1 pound of payload.
So where's the extra fuel on the Saturn V rocket to launch the Apollo 17 craft with the additional rover, the additional consumables? Where is all that? Because the Saturn V rocket didn't appear to change its shape or size between Apollo 11 and Apollo 17 because it had already been manufactured. But they would need to carry probably the best part of another 1,000 tons of fuel.
1,000,000 tons of fuel. Well, 1,000 to 1. you need 1 million more pounds of fuel. 1,000 to 1, right?
Yeah, 1,000 to 1. Okay.
And you're going to add 10,000 pounds to your payload.
So that's the best part of 500 tons, 1 million pounds of fuel. Now, 500 tons of fuel requires additional fuel to lift that.
Exactly. You're into the diminishing returns.
Yeah. So you need to make the Saturn V rocket larger to carry the bigger fuel tanks. But we don't know about bigger fuel tanks. It makes no sense. They launch these things and we're all shown the Saturn V rockets and they all look exactly the same size, whether it's for Apollo 8 or Apollo 17. They don't change size. Apollo 8 didn't carry anything really. It didn't carry a lander, just carried 3 astronauts and a Bible. So they could read Genesis as they went around the back of the moon at Christmas time. But Apollo 17, they spent 3 days on the lunar surface, 3 EVAs, and the rover, plus all the extra sandwiches they'd need to keep themselves healthy. But we don't know, we don't hear about that. It's the same thing with that Apollo 13 delta V calculation, which Tim Dodd was so keen to show his ability to do it and to show it was all perfectly normal.
Yeah.
Well, do it for Apollo 13, assuming they even got to the moon, which they didn't, but that's another story. Assume they got to the moon, came back. Where's the delta V for getting out of lunar orbit? Didn't show that.
Now, when you start looking at the details in there,
I know.
their story falls apart.
The story fell apart years ago, but nobody is going to come up and admit it. You get people like the everyday astronaut, Tim Dodd, doing his... I would say it was a well-produced film. There was a lot of money behind it. And I had to endure about 15 minutes of advertising on YouTube while I watched it. So that's where he gets his money from. And he's got a few 100,000 views on it. Obviously, he's got a big following. He's quite popular, talks to all the right people. He even managed to speak to our great friend Don Pettit on the ISS. That was quite an achievement. Well, good for him. If he's got all the connections with NASA, he's not going to start pulling NASA apart, is he?
No. The thing is he is a really good NASA parrot.
This is interesting because if the delta V to leave the lunar surface and to begin the return journey home to Earth, let's say, now they're claiming the delta V is about 2,000 to 2,500 miles per hour. Doesn't it have to be more than that? The moon's still pulling you back at that point.
Yeah. It's pulling you back all the way to the neutral point. That's what gravity does. It pulls you back. So I think if you do the calculation for delta V on Apollo 13, you'll find it doesn't work. So the whole thing is a fabrication. Space rescue was what we're being shown. The numbers just don't add up.
Another thing, for all of these Apollo missions except for 13, why would you ditch the LEM after you've docked to it, transferred everything over, and then let it go back to the lunar surface? Now, can you imagine if Apollo 13 would have done that and they would have had an accident? They would have been stuck there in lunar orbit. They never would have got home. You see, this makes no sense to me. You don't ditch a potential lifeboat. Apollo 11, they crashed that on the moon because they wanted to listen to see if it was going to ring like a bell. They wanted to check seismic reading. So there went that one.
It's funny how they just fall out of orbit and just straight down. And the rest of the time, they would stay in orbit. If they're traveling at orbital speed and you let them go, it shouldn't just fall down to the moon and be able to record anything.
There was enough fuel left in the thrusters, and that's what they did.
Who's operating the thrusters?
Did the retros fire on Apollo 11 LEM after jettisoned? And it said, yes, the retros were fired for a free fall back to the surface, and then gravity took over. Well, I asked it again this week. Did the retros fire on the Apollo 11 LEM after jettisoned? No, the Apollo 11 lunar module did not fire any retro rockets after jettisoned from the command module. And then it goes on to further, it says, with no further maneuvers or retrofire, lunar gravity caused the Eagle's orbit to decay over time. In fact, weeks. In fact, possibly months. Which is it, weeks, months, or years?
And were those rockets fired or not? And who fired them? And how did they fire them?
Oh no, it said that that's not true. But it just contradicted itself. Because I have a screenshot of the one that I took on February the 7th.
You can just shovel as much as you want. I'm not believing any of that crap. But the thing fell straight. They even got video of it falling down right to the lunar surface. And it stays right there, right in the camera view the whole way.
It's good.
Well, that's just a movie sequence. That's all.
Yeah, Lookout Mountain Laboratory at work again.
There's absolutely no way. You wouldn't see it. You wouldn't do it at 6,000 miles an hour. If it fell away from you and it's falling down there, it would be so far behind you. If it changed direction, I mean, people don't understand the speed that you're traveling at. Even you're twice the speed of a bullet. Once you're into the 2,500, 3,000 miles an hour, you got a fairly high-speed bullet. And they're trying to line up, they're trying to dock, they're trying to do everything. It's quite the story.
Oh, it's a good story. And it all makes sense. If you look at it just superficially, the story makes sense. But if you look in detail and you look at it from a scientific point of view, not a conspiracy point of view, a scientific point of view, like what speed do you need to orbit the moon at and how do you calculate that, which we've done? High-speed bullets, are slower than that. So you've got a lot of things going on if you're doing at that speed. And how much training did anybody have to be able to accomplish all these things? Not a great deal.
Now they're saying that the Apollo 11 LEM, once it docked, it was jettisoned, and now it took weeks before it crashed back to the moon. What happened to the other part that they fired, the retro? They've changed it.
It's very strange, the whole thing. It just doesn't add up. This is the point. And this is where so many of the Apollo supporters go wrong. They don't have the detail, or they're not prepared to look at the detail that we've looked at and come to the conclusions we have. And if somebody can correct us, say we're wrong with what we're saying, let's hear about it. But if they don't know the detail of what actually happened and how it happened and what the calculations are, they can't really criticize us for saying it never happened, because they don't know enough detail to be able to prove it did. That's all to do with delta V and speed of entry and all the rest of it. On Apollo 17, you've got the lander, you've got the extra batteries, you've got the extra consumables, you've got all this stuff that we're told Apollo 17 had. And we know it's 1,000 to 1. Where's all that fuel? How much was pumped into the Apollo 17 Saturn V rocket before it took off?
Eagle likely crashed onto the lunar surface within days, weeks, or months after the mission. And it says NASA did not track its final impact, so the exact crash site remains unknown. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The very first craft that they sent there, and they don't know what happened to it. They don't know where it crashed.
In the same way, they don't even know where Apollo 11 landed, because we're told Armstrong had to avoid the boulders. What do you mean boulders? This is supposed to be a flat, clear plain. That's why they chose it. Collins up in the command module didn't know where they were. They must have flown a long way away. We're told it was about 3 miles from the intended landing site, but nobody knew where they were. And if you ask NASA what is the location of the Apollo 11 site, you get 10 different answers.
We know the answer, Flagstaff.
Well, also, they never went in the first place, so they didn't have a landing site. No wonder they can't find it.
Well, this is interesting because, again, it says the moon's uneven gravity, mascons, makes low lunar orbits unstable. Well, what do you classify as a low lunar orbit? 60 miles? 30 miles? You realize the lower you go, the faster you're going to have to travel. The lower you go, you're going to have to increase your velocity, planting yourself
You
onto
just
the
get
surface.
the math out and you take the mass on this side of the equation and the math on this side of the equation and you cancel them. You don't have to worry about it. So you can travel any speed you want because your mass doesn't count, so you don't have to be equal with the speed and the gravitational pull.
Yeah, well, just like this crashed into the moon at an unknown location. You mean they don't know where that LEM crashed?
No.
And yet, Bezos can go out in the middle of the Atlantic, just put his big fishing pole down and come up with an F-1 rocket. Unbelievable. Yeah. And they don't know when they're tracking all of this stuff where it is.
Oh, and it says, too, no telescope on the lunar orbiter has ever found the Eagle in orbit. It crashed.
But where did it crash?
They don't know.
But they photographed the whole lunar surface. Haven't they got enough people to examine it to find out where the Apollo 11 ascent stage actually is?
No, it says, final conclusion. The Apollo 11 ascent stage almost certainly crashed on the moon within months of the mission, but the final impact site is unknown to this day. To this day. To this day. To this day.